Good afternoon. I'm Natalie Foster, a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute and co-founder and president of Economic Security Project. And it is my pleasure to welcome you today to our conversation, Marketcrafters, the 100-year struggle to shape the American economy, a book talk with Chris Hughes on his powerful new book, Marketcrafters. And it frankly couldn't come at a better time. People are so disillusioned by the economy, how it works, for whom it works, and if it will even work for our children in the future. And in the midst of this, Chris offers us a bold and a necessary reframing that markets are not natural or neutral, but they are made, they are crafted, they are shaped by policy, by power, and most importantly, by people. So, this conversation is part of our Opportunity in America series, where we examine the changing economic landscape that workers face and how we can create an economy that works for everyone. We are so glad that you are all here today. Before we get started, let's do a quick review of the technology. So, everybody's muted today. And if you have questions, which we hope you do over the course of this conversation, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit and upvote questions. And we hope you'll share your perspectives, ideas, examples, or resources that you have to today's topic, things that are relevant to today's topic in the chat. And we'd love it if you would post about this conversation on the social media platform of your choice. The hashtag is Talk Opportunity. The event is being recorded and will be shared out via email and posted on our website. Closed captions are available for this discussion, so click the closed caption button, the CC button at the bottom of your screen to activate them. And now to the reason we are all gathered here today to speak with Chris Hughes. Chris is an economist and a writer who serves as the board chair of the Economic Security Project, a leading nonprofit advocating for economic power for all Americans, and was a co-founder of ESP alongside myself and Dorian Warren. Chris holds degrees in history and economics from Harvard, the New School, and is completing his PhD at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. His writings and essays have been published widely from the New York Times to the Financial Times. And his first book in 2018 was called Fair Shot: Rethinking Inequality and How We Earn. And I have such fond memories of that book coming out. So it's very exciting to have you, Chris, with your next book here in 2025. And it's just going back in history in 2004, Chris co-founded Facebook and then later directed Barack Obama's digital organizing efforts in President Obama's insurgent 2008 campaign. So that's around the time when I got to know Chris and have gotten a front row seat to watching your work, Chris, his work on rebalancing the American economy over a decade plus. So let's actually start there, Chris. I'm so glad you turned your attention to the economy. And I couldn't be, frankly, more important of a time to do it and of subject matter to take on. But tell us why. What shaped your journey? Why the economy and why this book?
Well, I'm happy to go there and anywhere else that makes sense in this conversation. But first, I just want to say thanks to you, Natalie, for that very flattering and kind introduction. And more importantly, for the past near decade uh, of working together as colleagues and as co-conspirators in the effort to make the economy more fair and prosperous, and also to Aspen for convening us today, and for everybody for tuning in. So, economics. Why economics? My career zigged and zagged for a little while until I found economics about 10 years ago, and then I feel like I've had a home. So, as you said, I was part of the founding team of Facebook in 2004 at Harvard. I had grown up in North Carolina. My mom was a public school teacher. My dad was a traveling paper salesman. I'd gotten financial aid to go to boarding school and then to Harvard. We started Facebook and it exploded. Everybody was interested in it. And I worked on the product and communications teams for several years. I liked it. I thought it was interesting. It was not a mission for me in the way that it was for Mark in particular, but also others on the founding team. And so I left to go work for Barack Obama, as you mentioned, for a couple years. And then I sort of wandered. I was in my late 20s. I had, to be honest, made more money than I could have ever dreamed. I paid off all my loans from college, obviously, and all kinds of things. And so I thought a little bit about venture capital. Then I worked in media for a while. But in 2016, after a lot of conversations with you and with other people, I began to focus more clearly on the question of how can we make the economy more fair. Income inequality, wealth inequality were all skyrocketing. This was right before Trump was elected. And my own story was, so bizarre. I had worked for a few years to create a company that at that point I was still generally proud of and made more money than we could have ever imagined. And while that had worked out great for me, it also didn't feel fair. It felt like emblematic of a kind of economy where a few people get these bonanza kinds of wins and everybody else is struggling to make ends meet. So that started on a long journey, first as an activist and nonprofit in the nonprofit world, and then over time, it's been more as a researcher and a writer. I got my master's. I began to work on my PhD. I wrote the first book. Now I've written the second, and I love economics because it's important. The study of money and production and how we coordinate, I think, is one of the most important stories in the history of humanity and the history of the United States. And it's also very much up for grabs. It's a field that is debated, and lots of people want to tell you exactly how it works. And you got to agree with most of the things in the textbooks, and that's just not what I do. I'm sort of naturally suspicious, and that means that I've gotten the opportunity to engage really on a first principles kind of level with a lot of economic ideas, and I find that challenging and fulfilling. So that's why I do what I do.
And this book went through many iterations before it landed as Market Crafters.
Yes, it
Tell us a bit
did.
about that.
Um, well, my a lot of the academic work that I've done is in the history of central banking. And so I thought that I was initially writing a history of the Federal Reserve and the history of American central banking. And that's where it began several years ago. And then there was this explosion of interest in industrial policy around 2021, 2022, this term that had been really banished from political and economic discourse, was taking center stage very quickly. And I was fascinated by that. I thought it was really important and exciting and relevant, but I also thought it was too limited because when people kept talking about industrial policy, they were using a term that most of the time was supposed to apply to like manufacturing and blue collar kinds of labor. And what I saw there was the government supporting a particular industry because it believed that it was important for whatever political ends. That could be semiconductor manufacturing, it could be climate, it could be a lot of things. But if you look at the history of American capitalism, we do that all the time. I mean, the story of finance and banking is a story where we believe that it is important. It's critical to keep prices stable, to have financial stability, to ensure maximum employment, moderate long-term interest rates, and all of those things are managed by government, and particularly the Fed, but not the Fed alone, the OCC, the SEC, to some extent the FTC and other institutions. And so what I saw was something broader, which a political scientist, Stephen Vogel, had coined the term market craft several years before, and that really stuck with me. And so I decided that I wanted to write a book that would combine my history, my interest in a lot of the institutions of American finance, like the Fed, with a history of industrial policy, purposefully to broaden out that term and to say that we have a long history of crafting markets towards political ends. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we fail. But we have to be clear-eyed about that history if we're gonna pull out some of the lessons for the future. And so that's what I am spending a lot of time doing these days.
Before we get into the economic specifics, you just have this metaphor of the garden that you worked in, I think grudgingly, if I remember, and how that is the metaphor you used when writing this book. Will you connect those dots for us?
Yeah, I'll try my best. So many of my friends do vegetable gardening and love it. It's a source of a respite and pleasure. And for me, my father had a vegetable garden growing up. I grew up in Hickory, North Carolina. We lived in a house that had a yard, but my dad tilled up a third of the yard. And for me, gardening was just the pits. It was the worst. Like on summer evenings when I want to be inside watching TV or reading, I had to go out and stake green beans, or excuse me, stake the tomato plants, or harvest the green beans, or deal with the squash. All this stuff that at least I, as a kid of 6, 7, 8, was not that interested in doing. However, all that time did lodge in my memory, and so when I was thinking about what kind of metaphor I could use to talk about how markets work, the one that I kept circling back to was the idea of a garden. And it was for a few different reasons. The first is, gardens are places of the natural world where there are organic forces that seem to be propelled by their own logic. So, the lifeblood of the system is the organic, the outdoors, and things grow. And there are also places where we acknowledge that growth and then we point it in a certain direction. We harvest all that energy towards a particular kind of production. And so, in some kind of free market fantasy, you might walk through the woods and just hope that you find some blueberries that you can eat or some tomatoes that are growing that you can eat. But no, well, the history of humanity is we say, no, we want those tomatoes. We like those tomatoes. We're going to take them. We're going to plant them in the garden. We're going to make sure they have the right amount of shade or the right amount of sunshine. We're going to make sure that they have water, maybe even fertilizers. And because we do all of this work to manage and harness those organic forces, what do we get? A lot more tomatoes. And we can, in fact, be innovative and even invent new kinds of tomatoes or engineer new kinds of tastier or nutritious food. And that metaphor of sort of organic forces that may seem uncontrollable, but then are harnessed towards human ends, things that can produce abundance, can produce more food than our ancestors could have ever dreamed of. That metaphor, I think, sticks with markets because markets, too, there are these cross-historical trends in markets, property law, stable currencies, exploitation of labor. There are these trends, some of which are good, some of which are very much not. And we can recognize that and still say, but wait a second, we want markets to work for us. Capitalism is something that we can shape and harness so that it works for people. People should not be working for capitalism. And so that metaphor made it into the introduction of the book, and it stuck with me.
I think it's great. And I'll make sure to um, lay it out to my kids when we garden in the future. But
They'll
I
love it
want to
more
talk
than I did.
more. What'd you say?
They'll love gardening more than I did, I'm sure.
Yeah, the pits.
Mhm.
Um, you let's talk about free markets because a second ago you called it the free market fantasy, right? Where we might get
Yeah.
blueberries if we're lucky. And I think that is so right on. And I'm curious, why do you think the myth of the free market is so durable? And uh, And then you have this the I word you call it, right?
Yeah.
Intervene. Talk a little bit about those two things.
Well, I think really until about 2016, 2017, I would have talked about the power of I don't know if I would have said free markets, but I would have talked about markets as if they were organic forces that come first. That markets work this way or that way, and then government is there to intervene to sort of the metaphor there is something like a stream rolling down a hill and government shows up to put a dam in or to change something that's naturally occurring, and that metaphor is one I use, and I think it's one that is continues to be pervasive, not just on the right but on the left. So when I was writing the book I was determined not to use the word intervene at any point. And so by the end, I did a little control F just to make sure in the manuscript I had not, because it's a sticky idea, and it's one that when we grasp for the language, that's what we find. But I think it's a really dangerous one because it does suggest that markets are just fine on their own. It makes no observations about the things that make markets work in the first place. The basics of property law, contract law, a stable currency, investment capital that can be developed and deployed, all of which rely on government, on public policy, even in the most libertarian kind of scenarios. Markets require government. And then what I see when I look at the history of American capitalism is something even more robust. Like if you go through some of the major markets in the United States, banking and finance, health insurance, pharmaceuticals, airlines, cars, defense production, semiconductors. I could keep going on the list. Every single one of these industries has been managed by policymakers for 100 years. And so there is the idea that there's a free market where government comes in afterward and then like moves things around is not empirically true. And yet that is still such a pervasive idea that we keep using, we keep coming back to linguistically. And that's one of the big reasons why I wrote the book is to, first off, just make it clear that markets are often managed and crafted, and then to explore, well, if we're going to do it, like a lot of those industries I just mentioned aren't going so well, health insurance, pharmaceuticals, et cetera. So let's talk about when it works and when it fails so that we can do it better.
Reading your book, it becomes so clear that markets are crafted, right? Even by the second section, it's like, oh yeah, of course. And yet, it is still a persistent myth. So who does it benefit to
Hmm.
believe in the free market fantasy? And then I guess the other question I have is, how do you make the case that of how this is relevant to the everyday family, right? That this enduring myth holds us back and harms the everyday family.
Yeah. Those are great questions. I think the myth of the free market is particularly useful for the most powerful market actors, which tend to be capital holders in a lot of cases, because markets are often dominated, sometimes by private actors and sometimes by public actors. And if you can get enough people to think that markets are somehow self-regulating, magically organizing, dynamic structures, you have made the case that government should be less active, and thus those who are most benefiting from that particular market order will stand to benefit even more. And depending on depending on the market, depending on the cost of capital, depending on the level of investment that needs to happen. You can have markets that, will move into a kind of naturally oligopolistic or monopolistic kind of arrangement. And the idea that that is the result of free market tendencies can enrich a lot of people in a very meaningful way. Now, even
Yeah.
in that story, there is still an important asterisk, which is what I call the emergency room. And we can see this super clearly in finance and banking. Even people like Alan Greenspan, who I spend a good chunk of time with in the book, who believed that government was often the problem, who was a deregulator, he also had a market craft, which we can talk about, towards financial innovation, which he believed would exert market discipline and, make the markets more stable. Even Greenspan became so well known for his emergency room actions, what many people might call bailouts or structured interventions. He did it in 1987. He does it famously with Mexico in the early 90s, then with long-term capital management in 1990. We can go through a long list. Even in the libertarian fantasy of the free market, there's still the state coming in to help capital holders when the emergencies come. And so that I think that sort of mythology, that story, has been particularly enduring and worked very well for those who had the most resources and the most power. And obviously, the one I'm trying to offer is one where we say, guys, we need to structure the market first in a way that makes it work for more people, that prevents those kinds of emergencies and bailouts in the first place. But the only way that you can follow a preventative regimen is if you know, understand that markets need management and structure in order to work well and in order to be stable, which I think we're closer to that set of ideas now than in 2007 when Greenspan stopped being, or 2006 when Greenspan stopped being Fed chair.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you think about the everyday family, I mean, what I hear in that is that costs are higher, that, there's a concentration of power and wealth within a market if we pretend that it doesn't require some market crafting. How do you talk about what it means for an everyday family?
Yeah, when I was finishing this book, I talked to a politician who was like, I like these ideas, Chris, but market craft is never going to work on the stump. Like that, it's just not, it's too heady, it's too intellectual. And I said to him, yeah, I know. That's not the idea. The idea is that you, as a policymaker, and other economists, influential folks, media, etc., can understand this as a key foundational observation for future policymaking. It need not, just as you wouldn't run on, like, competition policy or tax policy or industrial policy on the stump. No, in competition policy, you would instead talk about corporate power and how it's harming, the voters that you're trying to court and what you're going to do about it and how you're that particular story or market. So what I'm trying to say is I think market craft is relevant to everyone because how we craft markets matters enormously. And it need not be the kind of thing that we're all, chatting about around the Thanksgiving table. But now, when I talk to politicians these days and try to think about, well, what's the upshot of market craft for the moment that we're living in now? I think that some of the key urgent concerns that Americans have are around the cost of living. And there it's very clear that state action can craft markets to at least stabilize prices for housing, food, healthcare, childcare, if not even bring them down. And so, as much as I wouldn't, recommend like running on a market craft agenda in 2028 per se, I would say, hey, we can shape housing markets to make it easier to build, make it cheaper to build, and to build faster. And we can go through modular housing construction fund, zoning requirements, all the different ways that we can craft those markets to get that done. So I think it's key and critically important that policymakers and politicians understand the history of market craft so that they have the confidence to be able to say, we don't have to like just lean back and accept markets as they are. We can shape them to make them better.
Yeah. One of the things that your book did for me was once you've seen it and you lay it all out so clearly, right, over the course of 100 years, like ways in which we've shaped all the markets that you've named, you can't unsee it. And so part of what I'm hearing in your answer too is the way we talk about like the metaphors we use, for example. It may not be a politician talking about, market crafting on the stump, but if they talk about the economy like the weather, like something that
Yeah.
just happens to us, then they're reinforcing that fantasy of a free market as opposed to a clear role of government and business and society, all
Yeah.
having roles to play in creating an economy that works for everyone.
Yeah, and it can apply. I mean, housing is a topic that is partially because of its centrality in the abundance agenda that
Mhm.
and people in policy world have been talking about recently, but it's obviously been an urgent problem for Americans for years now, particularly after the run-up in costs that came after the pandemic. And I think a lot of politicians, including Democrats, did not understand the urgency of this as an issue. But that's a useful one to think about how to craft those markets. So in the book, I go back to the 1930s when housing market craft really began with the creation of Fannie Mae and a set of policies that made it much easier and cheaper for Americans to buy homes. America has the 30-year mortgage, which was pioneered in the New Deal era. We had the National Investment Bank called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that created a market for these mortgages so that someone could loan to somebody in Denver to build a house and a banker in New York could buy it. And once you make it more liquid, you make it cheaper. And over the course of 30, you amortize it over the course of 30 years, suddenly housing became much more affordable to a lot more folks. And of course, the more houses you build, the more jobs you have. And the story goes. So that market was very intentionally crafted in that period. And then I think lots of people know now about the history of zoning and how government has, crafted cities in a way that sometimes has worked well, sometimes has become too sclerotic. But then you zoom forward to today, and I think we need to have an urgent question about how we can craft housing markets to meet the housing shortage that we have. I mean, the estimates are that we need somewhere around 4 to 5 million new housing units to be built. And with interest rates as where they are now, relatively high, there's not a lot of building happening, even in places like California, where a lot of the zoning rules have been reformed, as the abundance folks make a lot of hay out of. So what do you do? I think you have to have something like a housing construction fund that creates a structure that ensures that the rates that multifamily developers, those who build dense housing, can have so that when rates go up, they have a more stable rate. And when rates come down, they have a more stable rate so that they know that it's going to be affordable. So the math works for them to build. I think, and by the way, some of the estimates on that mean that you could build over 1 million housing units just through the creation of a $50 billion fund, which sounds like a lot, but in the context of the full federal budget, which is several trillion dollars,
Yeah.
it's pretty affordable given the urgent need. You could have an industrial policy for modular. Modular is the kind of housing where it's built off site and then you bring it on site and it's fabricated. Excuse me, it's the fabricated parts are used to build very, very quickly. And half of the homes in the Nordic countries are built this way. We could do that in the United States. There are challenges to it. One of the biggest is the lack of private capital that's moving into that. Public dollars can attract those private dollars. So I'm saying all of that as a way of gesturing towards the important need to think about how can we craft markets, housing markets, to bring down prices and to boost supply. And we can use that kind of framework for housing. We could use it for eggs and commodity prices. You can use it for care. You can use it for a lot of these things to get to an agenda that is, at the end of the day, somewhat simple and direct and speaks to the needs that American families have.
Let's stay on housing for a second and digging into that example you're giving. We start to see some of the core elements of market crafting as you lay out, right? So I hear an institution, right? Housing construction fund, that would be important, institutional player. I hear the need for leadership. Name some of the elements here that you think are key to market crafting.
So when it goes well, I see three things that happen in those stories. And the book is a collection of a dozen different stories or moments focused around the people who are the market crafters, hence the name. And some of them fail, and many of them succeed. So the ones who succeed, um, there tend to be three ingredients. First off, there's a clear mission. So build X number of housing units in the context of housing, or it could be um, onshore semiconductor manufacturing, or um, it could be ensure energy prices remain stable, or financial stability. The mission has to be clear, sensical to everybody, and aspirational. Secondly, you have to have an institution that you can hold accountable for it. We really don't like institutions in the United States for the most part. We fear the consolidation of power, particularly in the federal government. And the irony is, a lot of the institutions that we have, when we create them, and then when we give them the third ingredient, which is power and discretion to accomplish a mission, they can be very effective. So the Fed, I think, is maybe one of the best examples that's out there. The Fed has a clear mission, price stability, maximum employment, and it has read financial stability as a piece of its mandate as well. It has, an institution that is very clear. The central bank is, it's very complicated, of course, with the FOMC and the Board of Governors and the reserve banks and da 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 da. Da, but nonetheless, there's an institution that we can hold accountable to fulfill that mandate, and it has a lot of discretion and power, and it makes mistakes for sure. We just came out of a period of high inflation, and so it is by no means perfect. But generally, if you zoom out for a second, you say, wait a second, there's a reason that finance loves having the Fed. It's because they set the price of short-term credit. They make sure that price stays stable, and that enables that industry to invest with confidence and assuredness of what the cost of capital is going to be like in the short term and the medium term. And so I think that those ingredients of mission, institution, and power are really key. You see it in semiconductors, you see it in energy price stability, you see it in a lot of the other things that are in the book. And that's the kind of approach that I think is more often. Of course, that is very much not in the zeitgeist now. We are living through a moment where on the right, as we've seen, they're trying to bludgeon government and the institutions of government. Now, there is a steelman argument that they would say, well, they've become sclerotic, they've become inefficient, and we need to have them be more accountable to the executive. I think that's mostly a theoretical argument. In practice, that doesn't seem like what Doge in particular has actually been doing. But there is a sense that the institutions are the problem on the right. And as much as I agree with some of the conclusions of the abundance movement, I think underneath it, there is also a kind of appeal to common sense. Well, don't you know the institutions of government, again, are really the problem? That's why we don't have cheap housing in the United States. And it takes you to, it's a different politics, so it takes you to a different conclusion. But on both sides, there's a wariness of institutions. I think that's been much more common than not in the history of America. And from where I sit, what I'm trying to do with this book is to say institutions are fallible, but they also often really succeed. So instead of just saying the institutions are always the problem, let's take a magnifying glass to the moments when government actually works so that
Right.
we can not just celebrate those, so that we can replicate them, because there are many, many problems that we are going to need government to help solve.
Well, let's spend the last 10 minutes, and then we'll go to questions from folks on the Zoom with us. But let's spend the past 10 minutes talking about one of those ingredients that make institutions work, which I really do think is leadership and
Yeah. Yeah.
the people who hold the mission, articulate the mission. And I love the stories throughout this book. Like we learn about Bill Martin's one of the longest serving Fed chairs, that like his dedication to his faith and his tennis game were part of what set him up for, five different presidential administrations. Is that right? That he was the Federal Reserve Chair through?
Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson. Yeah. 4 or 5. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's stories like that, which well, I just have been amazed at, what you were able to find. But from antitrust enforcers to central bakers, it's like the market crafters, right, are part of, are really what animates this book. So tell us about one of your favorites from the past, and then I'd also love for you to tell us about one of the market crafters from a more current era, which I think you call new market crafting, the sort of last section of the book,
Yeah.
which includes a lot of the Biden folks. So
Yeah.
start with the history though. Let's go there. Let's go back for a second. Tell us
Yeah.
about a market crafter, um,
Yeah.
and
Well,
what they did and how it shaped American history.
I think the thing that sustained me in writing this book was the people. And I was writing it, and so I hope that it is what sustains the reader. I wrote it as a collection of a dozen different stories and moments in time. And don't tell my publisher, but I wrote it so that if one does not want to read it cover to cover, that is a-okay. They always say you should write a book in the way that you want, the way that you want, the book that you want to read. And for me, a lot of books, I'll read the introduction and the first chapter, and then I'll go through the table of contents and see the chapters that are most either the stuff I know a lot about. I want to see what the author has to say about it, or things I know nothing about, and I just want to learn something new. So I wrote the book so that you could do that if you wish. I mean, a lot of people have read it cover to cover, which is, just great too. Um, and so because of that, I got to go really deep into these character stories, and you really, you feel like you get to know them. You're going through their correspondence, their appointments books, they do oral histories in many cases, in the last decades of their life. So you hear them reminiscing. In some cases, I talk to their kids. Anyway, I did a lot of character research around the market crafters, and the ones that I found that were the most fascinating were the ones who I thought were most entrepreneurial. I do
Mm.
think that is the word. And they came in ready with a idea of what they wanted to see, and then they were creative in getting it done. And so one that I'll talk about is actually he was the most difficult character for me to write about. His name is Bill Simon, and he was the Treasury Secretary in the Nixon administration. He was a libertarian who didn't really believe in government so much, and yet ends up in the Nixon administration being put in charge of oil and gas. And the Yom Kippur War happens, and the oil embargo is a result. And all of a sudden, he is responsible for ensuring that nobody in America freezes to death in the first oil crisis.
Wow.
And he's actually very successful. So he crafts markets. He does a few things. He he stockpiles the oil and gas reserves. He does resource allocation to industries to make and to geographies, making sure that hospitals and the military are taken care of. He creates price controls so that allowing the prices to go up, but more moderately than they do in Western Europe. And through all of this work in that crisis moment, on the other side of it, the actual first oil crisis in the 1970s was relatively successful. He did a good job, and he was a difficult guy to read his stuff because he's not a person I would have been friends with. And yet it was hard not to come to that conclusion. And that's in contrast to what happens at the end of the decade in the second energy crisis when Jimmy Carter is president. And after the Iranian Revolution, he makes the move to decontrol prices, to just sort of let it all go and say, you know what, the market is going to just sort it out. And prices skyrocket. There are the lines that we all remember culturally as part of the problem. And so it was like the mirror image of that story. The institutional thing though that comes out of the Simon experience is they create the Strategic Petroleum Reserve,
Mm,
which stores hundreds of millions of gallons of oil in these salt caverns in the southeast of the United States, and it still exists today. And it's one of the big reasons why we have had significantly more energy stability, at least until recent years when domestic production significantly increased. So Simon was fascinating, but there were so many other characters. Andrew Brimmer, who was the first black governor of the Federal Reserve, is in the book, who really hustles to make global finance work, and his story is fascinating. I talk about this woman, Nancy Teeters, in the midst of the Volcker shock, who wanted to find a different way to squelch inflation that didn't have such an extreme effect on manufacturing jobs. The stories were what sustained me.
yeah, absolutely. And it's what makes it so fun to read too. I mean, not only is it, it's sweeping history, but then people, and some of whom we've heard about, but most of whom we haven't.
Yeah,
And it's a wonderful glimpse into their lives in that period of time.
yeah,
And the hard part about um, the period of time we're living in is you don't always see it as history making. It's just sort of the headline of the day. And one of the things your book did was situate the last 4 years, the last 6 years really, in the historical context. So tell us about a market crafter that we do know, whether it be Lena Khan
yeah.
or Brian Deese.
Yeah, I focus on two folks in the past 15 years, but with a lot of supporting characters. The final quarter of the book is contemporary, and it was a totally different way of researching. The first sections were much more in the archives and, trying to recreate these people who are not alive. The later chapters were something I lived through and people that I could interview. So, Brian Deese is a fascinating character. He's not a household name for sure. He was the director of the National Economic Council under Joe Biden. And I think his story matters because he's emblematic of a shift in political economy that has happened over the past 15 years. He grows up as part of the crew in the 2000s with Jason Furman and Larry Summers. He actually works for Larry and Jason in the early White House. And he's charged in the Obama White House, and he is charged with overseeing auto bailouts. If you remember in the great financial crisis, not only did the banks all threaten to go under, but GM, Chrysler, Ford, all of these companies were just hemorrhaging money. And, the government steps in, provides that kind of emergency room assistance. And the lesson that Brian takes away from that is radically different than the lesson that Larry and others. And I talked to them both about that experience, and their answers were just like diametrically opposed. Brian's takeaway was, these markets need to be managed so that we never get back into an emergency room kind of situation. So a bailout is not what you need to be talking about. Whereas in the classic sort of economics, neoclassical vernacular, it would be about market failure. Well, markets sometimes fail, and government, has to take care of that. That could be with an externality, that could be in a crisis moment, but that's just sort of how markets work and what government's there to do. So Brian took away this lesson, and then he continued to do all kinds of interesting things. In the Obama administration, he becomes the climate czar. He's at OMB for a time. But in the Biden years, he becomes the director of the National Economic Council, and he assembles a team of people who are very focused on spurring clean energy investment, bringing back the semiconductor industry to the United States, making major investments in infrastructure. And on each one of those things, the Biden folks succeed legislatively and substantively. Now, of course, the inflation that happens with up to 9%, turns everyone's attention away from those pieces of the agenda and towards price stability. And Americans, rightly, understandably, suffer and are very angry about it. And of course, Joe Biden didn't win the election. It was partially because of the economic legacy. But I think it's critically important to separate those two things out. The inflation was not caused by that legislation. Even uh, the uh, the highest estimates that come from moderate economists like Olivier Blanchard or Ben Bernanke are that about 2% at most of the 9% of inflation was related to that early ARP stimulus bill. The vast majority of the inflation was because of the supply chain bottlenecks that we all experienced in that rapid shift in consumer demand. And yet, and yet, so many people just want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So the last thing that I want to say on this is I think that, wherever you might stand on Bidenomics, it is clear that there is a new kind of conventional wisdom on the right and the left, which puts the state at the center of economic stories. And the question is not like, how do we get government out of markets these days? It's between like, should tariffs be broad-based or should they be targeted? Should
Hmm.
industrial policy be just for national security reasons, or might it be important to have critical minerals here to support a private industry as well? That's the contour of the conversation, and that is very different than the world that Brian started out in, 15 plus years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. A paradigm shift.
A paradigm shift.
Um, Chris, I guess to the first question that I'm seeing in the chat, and this is from Edmund Morris, and if I can distill it down, I think he's asking essentially, are there some things that just don't need to be in the market that should be a public good for people? Healthcare,
Yeah,
education, he names out. And how do you think about that related to market crafting?
yeah, I think so. It seems we have an agreement in the United States that education, at least K through 12 education, should not be driven by market forces. And I think that's a good thing. Um, we do not have that agreement on healthcare, as lots of other industrialized countries do. And I think that it causes Americans to pay double what people in Western Europe pay for healthcare with health outcomes that are roughly on par. So I think it's really important to say, in fact, one of the more difficult chapters for me to write in the book was the one on healthcare, because even before I embarked on it, I hesitated to say, you know, is this really what I want? Is our healthcare markets are crafted for sure by the state, and we can, I focus on the creation of Medicare and Medicaid in the 1960s, but I could have written it about the ACA. You could write it about many of these different moments. You see government trying to shift a market and point it in a way that makes it cheaper for certain goods, that makes it more accessible, that makes it work in a different way. But just by talking about it as a market, am I going to sort of reinforce that idea
Mm,
that healthcare should be a market? And I think I managed to not do that at the end of the day, but I think that tension is very very alive and well. And there are a lot of places where I think we don't have a cultural or political consensus. For instance, student loans. There's certainly a market dimension for those, and you can make an argument for it. You can make an argument against it, but uh, it's really tricky.
yeah. This your book really and your thinking influenced me when I was writing The Guarantee,
Yeah,
my book, Inside the Fight for America's Next Economy. And both of those instances were really tricky to write about, healthcare. If we're in this moment where we've passed some of the most important subsidies that we've ever seen. They're robust to enroll people onto the ACA. So it's like we've had this deeply imperfect system, this market system, and then we've figured out crafting that helps make it work, right? So 10 million more people were part of the ACA over the last few years than were in the past because of these subsidies that are going to expire in just a few short months. So it's like we're a ticking time bomb that will have a huge impact on upcoming elections, on
I know,
people's individual lives. And
I
it's
know.
like all interesting because in this case, it's market crafting that feels invisible to so many people
Well, I
until
think
the
that's
time bomb goes off and then it won't be.
But that's why we get back to, well, when you have successful market craft, you build an institution with the mission of making healthcare cheap. And so instead of putting subsidies all over the place in the tax code that expire and you have to renew every year, you could have just had Medicare have either an option for everyone to join. And obviously, politically, that wasn't possible. So it's not everything's 2020. In retrospect, it's less about blame and more about, well, why wasn't it possible? Why do we still struggle to say, actually, we should have an institution that is responsible for providing quality, affordable healthcare to all Americans. And when we do that, we can hold it accountable. People hold Medicare rightly accountable for what it does with seniors. Historically, the prices have been managed by Congress. Now we have Medicare Advantage plans, which I think need to be meaningfully reformed. But my point is like when you craft the market to bury it in the tax code and provide these incentives, rather than either creating or reinforcing an existing institution with the power, uh, ironically, we get much more balkanized, less efficient healthcare that's more politically fragile than if we just done it the clear way in the first place.
Did your, what are some of the opinions were there any opinions you had that shifted as you wrote the book?
That's a great question. I mean, I certainly learned an enormous amount. I don't know if there were any closely held opinions that changed because of the research. I think that maybe my position on discretion and power in the administrative state, to use a sort of wonky set of words, evolved over time. I think, I have been and am sympathetic to a lot of the concerns about the administrative state being too isolated or insulated. But most of the time, when I looked at government workers doing their jobs, I saw them struggling for resources and power to get things done. And then when they got it, they more often than not succeeded. And then, so I definitely became more sensitive to all of the restraints that we
Mm,
have put on government, thinking that it is going to be a good idea. I mean, the paperwork reduction. I mean, we could go through specific examples of things that sound good in theory, but limit discretion and power and sort of hobble the state. So that might be one thing. Another thing would be the role of Congress. We live in this time that is hyper partisan. And I
yeah.
think people are very suspicious of Congress being able to get anything done. And the Congress under Joe Biden was quite productive and often on bipartisan lines. I mean, everything from the confirmation of Lena Khan to the CHIPS Act to the infrastructure bill to, these are things that I think that we need to take note of and ultimately expect Congress to be in the driver's seat. And these days, particularly on the right, the theory of the unitary executive, the president is the only person who's going to be able to actually get the administrative state into shape. And I see Congress as the ultimate boss of the Fed or Fannie and Freddie or a lot of these institutions. And I think that's a better arrangement than investing it all in the executive.
Yeah, very relevant for today's headlines. A couple questions come together at this nexus. What Tony Simon said in project development, government action has been primarily limited to mitigating potential harms, for example, through NEPA and permitting. What can be the narrative around government advancing community benefits? And then Allison Lingane says, if you were to lay out a market crafting agenda, right, that could like a government advancing market crafting agenda that could result in changes that are helpful to everyday people, what would it look like? I thought
Mhm.
that was an interesting way to frame it from the passive to the sort of
Yeah.
proactive.
Yeah, 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 I think so too. The first question in some ways feeds into the second. Listen, I think the number one thing that Americans are frustrated about is costs and dignity.
Mm,
And the second is harder to solve, but I think needs to be part. If I were, you know, if I were advising a politician, I think she or he would need to speak to both. On costs, we talked a lot about housing already. But I think that agenda would be where I would start. So housing, food costs, care costs, and on each one of these, crafting those markets to either stabilize those costs or bring them down. I think you also need to talk about jobs because Americans care about how expensive things are, but people want a stable job. That's like this is not a big insight over here. This is in not just polling, but just everyday conversations with people. And so that means thinking about higher minimum wages, sectoral bargaining, a lot of these things that Democrats have talked about for some time, but I think they need to explain how those are going to help people. And then the harder set of issues, I think, is around sort of future proofing, to use a term, because there are a lot of threats on the horizon. I mean, climate is an obvious one. I live in New York and our air is full of the smoke from the Canadian wildfires, and this now
mm,
seems to happen every single year. I read yesterday that the dust from the Sahara has affected air quality levels in the southeast. Anyway, you're reminded of like the global nature of these problems and the fact that public policy needs to respond to it. And AI. I mean, AI is radically changing, I think, how we all live, and that'll only accelerate. And there'll be significant labor market disruptions that come for it. And this time, less so for blue collar folks and more for white collar. So I think a market crafting agenda that speaks to those things is uh, is critical. But I will say, you don't need to use the word market craft on the stump. You know what I mean? It's about the outcomes for people.
yeah.
I think that's what people care most about. The how, industrial policy, this and that. How are you going to do this with the tax cut deduction? You know, that's the how the sausage is made, and so that may not be stump ready.
Well, it's stump ready for me, so I'll vote for you.
That's running for anything.
Last question is just who are some of the market crafters today? Obviously you wrote
Yeah.
this book in a different administration, in a different world, and now you're talking about it in a moment that is,
Yeah.
completely shifted. And so
Yeah.
how do you think about the market? How do you think about what market crafting in the headlines today and who are, if they exist,
Yeah,
who are the market crafters?
the irony is in the first Trump administration, there were real gestures towards market crafting. A lot of the tariffs in that administration were more targeted and than the ones today. And the CHIPS Act actually started in the Trump administration. It was a Trump idea to pursue. So there was a market craft in that. This administration is their economic policy seems to be defined by impulsive decisions around tariff and trade, and increasingly around tax cuts for the wealthiest on the backs of cutting Medicaid and food stamps. And so
Hmm.
there's not a lot of market craft to be seen, is what I'm trying to say. There are some examples. Listen, the steel and aluminum tariffs are a clear market craft. They want to reinforce that industry for the jobs and for national security reasons. You can agree with it or disagree with it, but that is a market craft. The crypto reserve fund, which they've created, it's small, it's only $20 billion, but nonetheless, there is a mission build and deepen the crypto markets, and they want to pursue that. So there are signs of this in the corners, but by and large, this is an across the board economic policies that affect markets in a significant way, and not the kind of market craft that we might have otherwise seen.
Well, in a decade from now, Chris Hughes, I really look forward to Market Crafters Volume 2. That will help us make even more sense of what it is. I just want to say, it was really a pleasure to read it. I am so grateful you wrote it because it's a gift to all of us to contextualize what we're living through in this moment. I hope folks pick it up. It's a beach read for all the nerds out there.
As well said.
And just couldn't thank you more for joining us today, Chris. So
Thank you for having me.
I hope folks will stay tuned for Economic Opportunity Program's next event on June 26th, Advising Small Businesses on Job Quality, Lessons from the CDFIs. And I want to thank our team at the Economic Opportunities Program, including Executive Director Maureen Conway, Matt, Francis, Tony, and Nora for pulling together today's event, and our colleagues at Architects. And we will see you all next time. Thank you for being here, Chris, and thank you all for joining us today.